Picture this, the royal palace of the Louvre, winter of 1392 AD. Candles sputter in iron sconces, their light barely penetrating the shadows that seem to breathe along the stone walls. The air hangs thick with the scent of melted wax, spilled wine, and something more primal, fear. You're standing behind the throne of King Charles VI of France, once called Charles the Beloved, now whispered about in trembling voices as Charles the Mad. The gods have stripped every piece of iron from the fireplace, because His Majesty fears metal. He hasn't touched another human being in months. Tonight, he demands that everyone approaching him wear gloves padded with silk, for fear their fingers might crack him like glass. He walks slowly, stiffly, each movement calculated with the precision of a man crossing ice over an abyss. He is convinced his bones will shatter if he bends too quickly. Servants have sewn iron rods into his clothing to keep his posture perfect, to prevent him from collapsing into fragments. He forbids anyone to touch him, even his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, whose hands, once caressed his face, now reach toward empty air. He believes his body is made not of flesh and blood, but of the most fragile crystal on earth. If I fall, he whispers to no one, to everyone, to the darkness itself, I will break. This isn't metaphor. This isn't poetry whispered by court singers. This is recorded royal psychosis, documented in the chronicles of Jean Froissart and the monk of Saint Denis, preserved in archives that still smell of medieval ink and madness. And it turned one of Europe's greatest kingdoms into a madhouse where reality itself shattered like glass under a hammer. Before we descend into this fractured reign, like and subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Because the story of the Glass King isn't just about madness. It's about what happens when a ruler's mind cracks and an entire empire splinters with it. It's about the moment when divine right collides with human fragility, and everyone discovers that crowns weigh far too much for glass to bear. The coronation of Charles VI took place in the Cathedral of Reims on November 4th, 1380 AD. He was 11 years old, a child dressed in robes so heavy they required 3 attendants to arrange them properly. The crown of Charlemagne, ancient and gold, settled onto a skull that hadn't finished forming. The cathedral echoed with prayers and hymns, but outside those sacred walls, France was bleeding. The 100 Years' War had already consumed 2 generations, turning fertile fields into graveyards, transforming prosperous towns into blackened ruins. English armies marched through northern France like locusts, and every harvest season brought the terror of raids, rape, and fire. Young Charles stood before the altar, anointed with holy oil that was supposed to transform him from boy to monarch, from human to divine instrument. But all the oil in Christendom couldn't prepare an 11-year-old for the weight he was about to carry. His father, Charles V, had been called Charles the Wise, a calculating ruler who had slowly pushed back English gains through careful diplomacy and strategic patience. But wisdom doesn't pass through blood. The father died at 42, exhausted by the burden of kingship, leaving his son to inherit not just a crown but an impossible legacy. The boy king was surrounded by wolves in noble clothing. His uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, Anjou, and Bourbon, circled him like predators around wounded prey. Each one saw the child not as a nephew to protect but as a puppet to control. They smiled and bowed and spoke of loyalty while their hands reached for the purse strings of the kingdom. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, was the most dangerous of them all. He treated young Charles with the kind of affection a farmer shows a prized cow, valuable property that needed careful management to yield maximum profit. For 8 years, these uncles ruled France in the king's name, draining the treasury to fund their own petty wars and elaborate courts while the kingdom groaned under taxation. Charles's childhood was not filled with games and laughter. It was an endless parade of ceremonies where he had to stand motionless for hours, of council meetings where grown men argued over his head, of tutors who taught him that his blood was sacred, that God had chosen him specifically to rule, that his every action carried divine significance. Imagine being told, at 11, that you are God's appointed ruler over millions of souls, that your decisions will determine who lives and dies, who prospers and who starves, that any failure on your part is not just political incompetence but a betrayal of divine trust. Imagine carrying that weight while your body is still learning how to be a body, while your mind is still figuring out how minds work. The pressure was crushing. Literally, Charles began experiencing headaches that would last for days, migraines so severe that he would have to retreat to darkened chambers, curtains drawn against even the faintest light. Court physicians prescribed rest, bloodletting, herbal remedies that did nothing except weaken him further. By the time he was 20, Charles had managed to take real control from his uncles. He dismissed them from the council, surrounding himself instead with advisors he chose himself. For a brief moment, France had hope. The young king seemed intelligent, capable, determined to restore his father's legacy. He commissioned chroniclers to document his reign, artists to paint his portrait, architects to expand the Louvre. He was building not just a kingdom, but a legend. But legends require strength, and Charles's strength was already beginning to crack. The headaches grew worse. The dreams became nightmares. He would wake, screaming about demons, about darkness, about a weight pressing down on his chest until he couldn't breathe. His physicians increased the bloodletting, convinced that bad humors were corrupting his blood. They didn't realize they were watching the early warning signs of something far more terrible than bad humors. Before he thought he was made of glass, he was already breaking. August 5th, 1392 AD. The forest road near Le Mans shimmers in heat that makes the air itself seem to bend and twist. King Charles VI rides at the head of a small army, perhaps 50 knights and men-at-arms, their armor gleaming like mirrors under the brutal summer sun. They are marching to punish a traitor. Pierre de Craon, a nobleman, had attempted to assassinate the Constable of France in Paris. The attempt failed, and Craon fled to Brittany, seeking protection from the Duke. Charles, determined to show his authority, had assembled this expedition to drag the traitor back to justice. It was supposed to be a demonstration of royal power. Instead, it became the moment when that power shattered completely. The heat is unbearable. Men and horses alike are suffering, their throats parched, their bodies drenched in sweat that stings their eyes and makes their armor feel like ovens slowly cooking them alive. The forest offers little shade, just patches of darkness between trees that seem to trap the heat rather than dispel it. Charles rides in silence, his face pale beneath his crown. He hasn't been sleeping well. The headaches have returned with renewed intensity, and something else has begun to creep into his thoughts, a feeling of unreality, as if the world around him is somehow less solid than it should be, as if everything might dissolve if he looks at it too closely. Behind the king, a young page named Guillaume walks beside his horse, carrying the royal lance. The boy is perhaps 14, nervous in the presence of so much martial power, terrified of making a mistake that might draw the king's displeasure. A beggar appears at the roadside, filthy, dressed in rags, his hair matted with dirt, and his eyes wild with something that might be madness or prophecy or both. He lurches forward, grabbing at the king's bridle, and his voice cuts through the heavy air like a blade. "King, ride no further. You are betrayed. Turn back before blood spills blood." The guards shove him aside, cursing him for his impertinence, but the beggar's words hang in the air like smoke. Charles's face grows even paler. His hands tighten on the reins until his knuckles show white through sun-darkened skin. They ride on. The forest seems to close in around them, the trees pressing closer, the shadows deepening despite the brutal sunlight. And then it happens. The page, Guillaume, stumbles. His lance slips from sweaty fingers and strikes against another man's armor. The sound rings out, sharp and sudden, a metallic clang that echoes through the forest like a bell announcing doom. Charles VI, King of France, beloved son of the Church, anointed ruler of one of Europe's greatest kingdoms, loses his mind. He screams. Not words, just a sound, primal and terrible. The cry of something that is no longer quite human. His sword is in his hand before anyone can react. He wheels his horse around, eyes rolling white with terror or rage, or something that combines both into a new emotion that has no name. "Traitors," he howls. "Enemies. They come for me. They come to kill me." And then he attacks his own men. The first blow takes off the head of a knight who had served the crown for 20 years. Blood fountains upward, catching the sunlight, turning it into rubies that splash across white surcoats bearing the fleur-de-lis of France. The headless body remains in the saddle for 3 full heartbeats before toppling to the ground. Charles doesn't stop. He rides through his own escort like death itself, his sword rising and falling, each blow accompanied by screams, his voice, his victims' voices, the horses shrieking in terror. 4 men die before anyone can react. 6 more are wounded, their blood mixing with the dust of the road. His closest companions finally manage to surround him, to drag him from his horse, to pin his arms and wrestle the sword from his grip. He fights them, foaming at the mouth, his eyes seeing not faithful servants but demons, monsters, enemies that only he can perceive. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ends. Charles collapses. His body goes limp in his captor's arms, and his eyes roll back until only the whites show. He convulses once, twice, then lies still, breathing but unconscious, his face slack and empty of all intelligence. When he wakes, hours later, in a nearby chapel where they have carried him, he remembers nothing. The dead nights, the blood still staining his clothes, the terror on his companions' faces, all of it is gone from his memory, erased as if it never happened. But everyone else remembers. And in that moment, on that dusty road in the forest near Le Mans, something fundamental changed in France. The divine king, the anointed ruler, the man whose blood supposedly carried God's own blessing, had revealed himself to be fragile, broken, dangerous. From that day forward, Charles would experience recurring fits. Periods of lucidity would give way without warning to episodes of violence, terror, or catatonic withdrawal. Sometimes he would recognize his wife and children. Sometimes he would stare at them as if they were strangers, or worse, threats. Sometimes he would spend days in silence, refusing food, refusing speech, staring at nothing with eyes that saw only darkness. The physicians called it melancholia furiosa. Today we might diagnose schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, perhaps even a form of temporal lobe epilepsy triggered by the stress of kingship and the consequences of generations of royal inbreeding. The French royal family, like the Habsburgs after them, had practiced strategic marriage within a limited pool of European nobility for centuries. Every recessive gene, every hidden weakness, every genetic vulnerability had been concentrated and magnified. But diagnostic labels matter less than the result. France now had a king who might, at any moment, forget he was king at all. But the madness would not fade. It would evolve into something stranger still. Between the episodes of violent psychosis, something else began to emerge. A delusion so specific, so bizarre, that it would define Charles's madness for the rest of his life and echo through European history for centuries to come. The king believed he was made of glass. It started subtly. In the months following the incident at Le Mans, Charles would move more carefully than before, his steps measured and cautious, as if walking on ice. Servants noticed that he would flinch when people approached too quickly, his hands rising instinctively to protect his body from contact. Then came the day when he refused to sit on his throne. The heavy oak chair, upholstered in velvet and decorated with gold leaf, suddenly seemed to him like an instrument of destruction. He stood before it for an hour, paralyzed by the certainty that sitting down would cause his body to shatter into fragments. "I cannot," he whispered to his attendants. "I am glass. I will break." The court physicians were summoned. They examined the king, checked his humors, prescribed more bloodletting, more herbal remedies, more prayers. Nothing helped. The delusion deepened, spreading through Charles's mind like frost across a window. He began wearing specially constructed clothing. Iron rods were sewn into his doublets and breeches, creating a rigid cage that held his body in a fixed position. He reasoned that if he could not bend, he could not break. He moved through the palace like a statue brought to awkward life, his joints locked, his spine straight, every gesture carefully controlled to prevent the shattering he knew was coming. He refused baths. Water, he explained to his horrified attendants, would weaken the glass, make it more fragile, more prone to breaking. For months at a time, he would not allow anyone to wash him, until the smell of his unwashed body became so powerful that courtiers would cover their faces with perfumed cloths when forced into his presence. Touch became impossible. Queen Isabeau, his wife, who had borne him 12 children, found herself forbidden from approaching him. When she tried to embrace him, he would scream and retreat, his face contorted with terror, convinced that her fingers would pierce his crystalline skin and cause him to explode into shards. The Palace of the Louvre transformed itself around his delusion. Servants learned to move silently, to speak in whispers, to avoid any sudden movements that might startle the Glass King. Furniture was removed from his chambers, for fear he might stumble and collide with something solid. The stone floors were covered with thick carpets to cushion any potential fall. But the most disturbing aspect was not the delusion itself, but Charles's lucidity within it. He did not rave or foam at the mouth or speak in tongues. He discussed his condition with perfect rational clarity. He could explain, in detail, exactly why he was made of glass, how it had happened, what precautions were necessary to prevent disaster. "You see," he told one physician, his voice calm and reasonable. "The transformation occurred during my illness. My flesh became transparent. My bones crystallized. My blood turned to liquid light. I am no longer fully of this world. I exist between the mortal and the divine, suspended in this fragile state until God sees fit to either restore me or allow me to shatter completely." It was madness delivered in the language of sanity, which made it somehow more terrible than simple raving. The king's mind had not abandoned reason. It had simply constructed an entirely different reality, complete and coherent and utterly divorced from truth. Between these episodes of glass delusion, Charles would sometimes return to himself. The lucid periods could last weeks, even months. During these times, he would govern, sign documents, receive ambassadors, make decisions. But everyone around him lived in constant dread of the moment when his eyes would glaze over, when his posture would stiffen, when he would begin moving with that terrible, careful precision that signaled the return of the delusion. Chroniclers from the period describe scenes of Gothic horror dressed in royal ceremony. Jean Froissart writes of a feast where Charles sat motionless at the head table for 4 hours, refusing food, refusing drink, terrified that the act of eating would crack his jaw. The monk of Saint Denis records an incident where the king wandered the palace halls at midnight, half naked, howling that he was melting, that someone had lit a fire beneath him and he could feel himself liquefying. The worst episodes involved complete identity dissolution. Charles would forget not just that he was king, but that he was human at all. He would refuse to recognize his own name, would insist that he was someone else entirely, sometimes a commoner, sometimes a saint, once memorably claiming to be Saint George and demanding a dragon to slay. His children learned to fear their father's presence. The Dauphin, young Louis, would hide when told the king was approaching, because he never knew whether his father would embrace him with tears of joy or stare at him with blank incomprehension, or worst of all, see him as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, watched her husband's mind crumble and found herself in an impossible position. She was still young, still vital, still fully human. But the man she had married, the father of her children, the king she was supposed to support and obey, had become a ghost wearing a crown. Court life adjusted around the madness. Nobles learned to speak of the king's illness in euphemisms, never directly acknowledging what everyone knew. Visiting dignitaries were carefully managed, their audiences scheduled during Charles's lucid periods, their visits cut short if the king began showing signs of distress. But you cannot hide a king's madness forever. Rumors spread through Paris, then through France. The King of France, the most Christian monarch, the ruler of the greatest kingdom in Christendom, had lost his mind. And worse, he believed himself to be made of glass. The glass did not just encase the king, it encased a nation, trapping France in amber while the world around it continued to move. Nature abhors a vacuum. Politics abhors a vacuum even more intensely. When Charles's mind shattered, it created a void at the center of French power, and into that void rushed every ambitious nobleman, every scheming courtier, every would-be kingmaker who saw opportunity in royal incapacity. The king's uncles, those same men he had dismissed years earlier, came crawling back like wolves returning to a carcass. But they were older now, and more dangerous, because they had learned patience. They didn't need to control the king directly, they just needed to control everything around him. Philip the Bold of Burgundy died in 1404, but his son John the Fearless was even more ruthless than his father. John understood that in a kingdom ruled by a madman, real power belonged to whoever could claim to speak in the king's name. And so began the great struggle that would tear France apart from within. On one side stood the Burgundian faction, led by John the Fearless, controlling the wealthy territories of Burgundy and Flanders, commanding vast resources and the loyalty of northern France. On the other side stood the Armagnac faction, named for Bernard VII of Armagnac, supported by the king's brother Louis of Orleans, and later by the Dauphin himself. They called it a regency crisis, a struggle over who should govern during the king's illness. But it was civil war, dressed in courtier's silk. The violence began with assassination. On November 23, 1407, Louis of Orleans, the king's younger brother, was murdered in the streets of Paris. 20 masked men attacked his small escort, dragging him from his horse, hacking at him with swords and axes until his body was so mutilated that identification was only possible by his jewelry. John the Fearless had ordered the killing. Everyone knew it, though it took years for him to admit it publicly. And when he finally did confess, he defended the act as tyrannicide, claiming that Louis had been plotting to usurp the throne and that murder in defense of the kingdom was not just permissible but morally required. Paris erupted. Riots swept through the streets as competing factions fought for control. The Butchers' Guild, allied with Burgundy, rampaged through neighborhoods loyal to Orleans, dragging men from their homes and slaughtering them in the streets. Blood ran in the gutters of the Rue Saint-Antoine, mixing with rainwater and refuse. Charles, during one of his lucid periods, wept when told of his brother's death, but his grief was brief, because the madness returned, and when it did, he forgot he had ever had a brother at all. The factions carved up France between them. Burgundy controlled the north and east, Armagnac the south and center. Each side claimed to govern in the king's name. Each side produced documents bearing the royal seal. The same king simultaneously ordered contradictory policies, signed treaties that nullified previous treaties, appointed men to positions already filled by his own previous appointments. Foreign observers watched in amazed horror as France, the greatest power in Europe, consumed itself. England, still technically at war with France despite periodic truces, saw opportunity in French chaos. King Henry V, young and ambitious, began planning an invasion that would exploit French division. But the true horror was not the political maneuvering. It was how the madness seemed to spread, infecting the entire kingdom with a kind of collective psychosis. On January 28, 1393, the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men, became a legend of Gothic horror that would haunt French memory for generations. Queen Isabeau organized a masquerade ball at the Hotel St. Paul to celebrate the marriage of one of her ladies-in-waiting. The entertainment included a troupe of dancers, dressed as wild men, their costumes made of linen cloth covered in flax and pitch to create the appearance of fur, their faces hidden behind grotesque masks. Charles, in one of his rare moments of playful lucidity, decided to join the dancers. He and 5 courtiers, dressed in the wild man costumes, chaining themselves together as part of the performance. They capered and howled, delighting the audience with their savage antics. Then the Duke of Orleans, Louis, not yet murdered, not yet cold in his premature grave, approached with a torch to see the costumes more clearly. Whether through accident or drunken stupidity or some darker intent, the flame touched one of the dancers. The costumes were soaked in pitch. They ignited instantly. 5 men burned alive on the ballroom floor. Their screams echoed through the vaulted chambers of the palace as they writhed in their chains, unable to escape the flames consuming them. Courtiers fled in panic. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, mixing with perfume and wine and smoke. Charles survived only because the Duchess of Berry recognized him and threw her skirts over his burning costume, smothering the flames before they could consume him. But he watched his companions die, watched them thrash and scream and finally go still, their charred corpses still chained together in a grotesque parody of the dance they had performed. The incident pushed him deeper into madness. For weeks afterward, he would wake screaming about fire, about demons dressed in burning fur, about the smell of cooked meat that he now associated with courtly entertainment. Paris began calling him the cursed king, whispering that God had turned his face away from France, that the royal family was being punished for sins no one could name, but everyone could feel. The madness became contagious in other ways too. Across France, people began reporting their own glass delusions. Nobles and commoners alike, suddenly convinced that they too were made of fragile crystal. It was as if the king's psychosis had become infectious, spreading through the collective consciousness like plague. Religious hysteria swept through the kingdom. Flagellants marched through city streets, whipping themselves bloody to atone for whatever sins had brought this curse upon France. Prophets appeared claiming that the end times had arrived, that the mad king was a sign of coming apocalypse. And through all of this, Charles himself drifted between lucidity and delusion, sometimes governing with intelligence and compassion, sometimes forgetting he was king at all, sometimes believing he was glass, sometimes believing he was something else entirely. The French court had become a stage where reality itself had lost all meaning, where the same man could be simultaneously king and madman, ruler and victim, divine appointee and pitiable wretch. And when glass finally breaks, it cuts everything around it. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria stands at the window of her chambers in the Hotel St. Paul, watching Paris burn. It is 1413 AD, and the city has erupted in violence again. Burgundian and Armagnac factions slaughtering each other in the streets, while her husband sits in his room, convinced that moving too quickly will cause him to shatter. She is 42 years old. Once, she was considered one of the most beautiful women in Europe, her portrait painted by the finest artists, her grace and elegance celebrated in poetry. Now she is called the she-wolf of France, a monster, a traitor, an adulteress whose appetite for power and pleasure has betrayed the kingdom. History will not be kind to Isabeau. The chroniclers, almost all men loyal to one faction or another, will paint her as evil incarnate, a Jezebel who destroyed France through her wickedness. But the truth, as always, is more complicated and more terrible. Imagine being married at 15 to a man who seemed kind and intelligent, only to watch him lose his mind before your 20th birthday. Imagine bearing 12 children to a husband who sometimes doesn't recognize you, who sometimes sees you as a threat, who sometimes believes that touching you will cause his body to explode into crystalline fragments. Imagine ruling a kingdom from behind a throne where a madman sits, trying to hold together a realm tearing itself apart, knowing that every decision you make will be questioned because you are a woman wielding power that should belong to a man. Isabeau did what she believed she had to do to survive, and survival, in the French court of the early 15th century, required making deals with devils. John the Fearless of Burgundy was one such devil. After murdering the king's brother, after seizing control of Paris through the Butchers' Guild and mob violence, John positioned himself as the kingdom's strong man, the only leader capable of bringing order to chaos. And he seduced Isabeau, not just politically but possibly physically as well. The rumors began almost immediately. Court gossips whispered that the queen and the duke were lovers, that they met in secret, that Isabeau's youngest children were not fathered by the mad king but by his would-be usurper. Whether these rumors were true or merely propaganda spread by enemies doesn't matter. In politics, perception becomes reality, and the perception of Isabeau as an adulteress and traitor would define her legacy. But then John the Fearless made a fatal mistake. In 1419, during a supposed peace conference on the bridge at Montereau, Armagnac supporters murdered him, splitting his skull with an axe while the Dauphin Charles watched. Whether the Dauphin ordered the killing or merely failed to prevent it remains debated, but the result was unambiguous. John's son, Philip the Good of Burgundy, swore vengeance, but he was pragmatic enough to recognize that revenge required allies, and the most powerful potential ally was England. Henry V of England had invaded France in 1415, winning the catastrophic Battle of Agincourt where English longbowmen slaughtered French knights by the thousands. Now he offered Burgundy a deal: help England conquer France, and Burgundy would be rewarded with territory and power. Isabeau, caught between a Dauphin who had murdered her ally and an English king who offered stability, made the choice that would damn her in French memory forever. The Treaty of Troyes, signed on May 21st, 1420, was a document of national suicide. In it, Isabeau and the broken King Charles, speaking through her because he could barely speak at all, agreed to the following terms. Henry V of England would marry Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles and Isabeau. Charles VI would remain King of France until his death, but Henry would become regent and heir, effectively ruling the kingdom. Upon Charles's death, the crowns of England and France would unite under Henry. The Dauphin Charles, heir to the French throne by every law and tradition, was declared illegitimate and disinherited entirely. The treaty was signed under the king's seal, stamped with wax that still bore the fleur-de-lis of France. But everyone knew that Charles himself understood nothing of what he was signing. Witnesses described him sitting at the table, staring blankly at the documents, his hand guided by others to sign his name in letters that barely resembled writing. Isabeau defended the treaty as necessary for peace. France had been destroyed by civil war. The English had already conquered much of northern France. The Dauphin had proven himself a murderer. Henry offered order, stability, an end to the chaos that had consumed the kingdom for decades. But France saw betrayal. A French queen had given France to England. A mother had disinherited her own son. The treaty was not peace, but surrender. Not diplomacy, but treason. For the last 2 years of his life, Charles VI was king of a France ruled by England. Henry V governed in his name, making laws, appointing officials, collecting taxes. The French crown, which had passed from father to son for 8 centuries, was now held by an English conqueror who slept with the mad king's daughter and made plans to rule both kingdoms once the Glass King finally shattered. Charles himself seemed barely aware of what had happened. In his lucid moments, he would sometimes ask where his son was, why the Dauphin no longer visited. No one had the heart to tell him that he himself had declared his son a bastard, had stripped him of inheritance, had given his kingdom away. In his mad moments, the question didn't arise, because he forgot he had children at all. October 21st, 1422 AD. The Hotel St. Paul lies quiet, except for the sound of labored breathing. In a chamber lit by candles that seem to struggle against an encroaching darkness, Charles VI, King of France, is dying. He is 53 years old, though his body is ancient, worn down by decades of madness, malnutrition, and medical treatments that did more harm than healing. His hair, once golden, fell out years ago, leaving him bald and somehow more fragile-looking, like a bird that has lost its feathers. His skin has taken on a translucent quality that gives his delusion about being made of glass a terrible irony. Around his bed stand physicians, priests, and a few courtiers brave enough or devoted enough to witness the end. Queen Isabeau is not present. She has not visited her husband in months, whether from guilt, grief, or simple exhaustion with a marriage that lasted 42 years, but ended long before death came to finish it. Charles moves very little. The delusion persists. Even now, at the edge of death, he lies perfectly still, terrified that any movement might cause him to shatter, convinced that death itself will come not as cessation but as explosive fragmentation. "Am I breaking?" he whispers to the physician leaning over him, his voice barely audible. "No, Your Majesty." The physician lies, because what else can he say? "You remain whole." But Charles is breaking. His breathing grows shallower. His eyes, those eyes that once commanded armies and signed laws and looked out upon a kingdom that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Low Countries, now see only shadows. In his final hours, there are moments of clarity, brief, agonizing moments when the madness lifts, and Charles understands exactly what has become of him, of his reign, of his kingdom. A tear slides down his cheek, and he tries to speak, but the words won't come. What does he want to say? Is it an apology for the bloodshed his incapacity enabled? Is it grief for the son he disinherited without fully understanding what he was doing? Is it simply acknowledgement of the cruel joke that gave him the throne of France and then stripped away his ability to rule it? We will never know. The words die in his throat, and with them dies the last king of the Valois line to rule an undivided France. He takes his final breath at 3 in the afternoon. The physicians note the time carefully, because even in death, a king's moments must be recorded for history. His body relaxes, that terrible rigid posture finally releasing, and for the first time in years, Charles looks almost peaceful. The physicians perform their examination, documenting the cause of death as an excess of melancholy humors. They note that the king's body is severely emaciated, that his internal organs show signs of long-term disease, that his brain, examined after the skull was opened, appears smaller than normal, with what they describe as unusual fluid accumulation. Modern medicine might diagnose schizophrenia exacerbated by repeated strokes, or perhaps a form of encephalitis that triggered both the psychosis and the progressive physical deterioration. But diagnoses matter less than results. Charles VI died as he had lived for 30 years, broken, fragile, trapped inside a delusion that no amount of royal authority could dispel. The funeral was a subdued affair, nothing like the grand state occasions that had marked the deaths of previous French kings. Paris was under English occupation. The Dauphin, the rightful heir, was in exile, gathering forces to reclaim his stolen inheritance. The kingdom Charles left behind was divided, devastated, and ruled by a foreign power. They buried him in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French kings. But even in death, he could not rest easily. His tomb was modest, befitting a king who had failed so completely. The epitaph made no mention of his madness, speaking instead of his piety and devotion to God, lies told in stone to preserve a dignity that had long since shattered. But history remembers. History always remembers. And what history remembers about Charles VI is not the brief promise of his early reign, not the children he fathered or the buildings he commissioned. History remembers the Glass King, the man who believed himself so fragile that touch itself could destroy him. His death left France in chaos. Henry V had died 2 months earlier, in August, leaving an infant son, Henry VI, as king of both England and France. The Dauphin, now calling himself Charles VII, refused to accept his disinheritance, gathering supporters who called themselves the Armagnacs and swore to expel the English invaders. The war that followed would last another 30 years, would summon Joan of Arc from obscurity to change the course of history, would finally end with French victory and English expulsion. But all of that came later, after the Glass King had turned to dust in his quiet tomb. You are back in that candlelit chamber in the Hotel St. Paul, but the candles are guttering now, their light fading. The guards still tiptoe past the door, though the king they feared to disturb will never wake again. The silence is profound, the kind of silence that follows when something that has dominated a space for decades suddenly ceases to exist. Charles VI lies motionless on silk sheets that cannot disguise what he has become. Not a king, not a man, a symbol of fragility preserved in death, looking almost like the glass he believed himself to be, translucent in the wavering light, breakable even now. They called him mad, but maybe he was only the first to realize how fragile power really is. Think about it. A king is told from birth that his blood is sacred, that God speaks through him, that his authority is absolute and eternal. He is wrapped in ceremony and ritual, surrounded by people who bow and scrape and treat his every word as divine truth. The entire apparatus of monarchy is designed to make a king believe he is invincible. And then the mind breaks, and the illusion shatters. And suddenly the king realizes that he is not invincible at all, that he is flesh and bone and brain chemistry, as vulnerable to collapse as any peasant in the kingdom he nominally rules. Perhaps the glass delusion was not madness at all, but terrible clarity. Perhaps Charles was the only one honest enough to see that crowns are made of glass, that they look eternal and unbreakable only because everyone agrees to pretend they are. The glass delusion did not die with Charles. It spread. For the next 2 centuries, across Europe, dozens of documented cases emerged of people, mostly nobles and scholars, who became convinced their bodies were made of glass. A French princess who refused to sit. A Dutch scientist who would not leave his house for fear of shattering. An Italian nobleman who padded his entire bedroom with feathers. Psychologists today call it the glass delusion, studying it as a historical culture-bound syndrome, a form of madness specific to a time and place. But what if it was something else? What if it was the unconscious mind's way of expressing what the conscious mind could not admit? That the entire social structure of medieval Europe, the divine right of kings, the rigid hierarchy of nobility, the pretense that some humans were fundamentally different from and superior to others, was as fragile as glass? Charles VI ruled France for 42 years. For 30 of those years, he was insane. His kingdom was invaded, dismembered, and nearly destroyed. His son was disinherited. His wife was vilified. His legacy was chaos. But he did not destroy France through weakness. He revealed what was already true, that the power of kings had always been an illusion, maintained only through collective belief. When that belief cracked, when people saw their anointed king drooling and screaming and forgetting his own name, they could no longer pretend that monarchy was divinely ordained. They had to confront the reality that kings were just men, as vulnerable to madness and decay as anyone else. Joan of Arc would eventually help Charles VII reclaim the throne. France would recover from the devastation of the 100 Years' War. The monarchy would continue for another 4 centuries. But something fundamental had changed. The spell was broken. The glass had cracked. Every throne is made of glass. It looks eternal, rests on tradition that stretches back centuries, gleams with the authority of gold and ceremony and divine appointment. But underneath the decorations, underneath the ritual and the proclamations and the crowns, there is only fragile human flesh, human minds that can break, human bodies that inevitably fail. Charles VI did not choose madness, but in a way, madness chose him to deliver a message that monarchy could not afford to hear, that power, built on the pretense of invulnerability, will always be vulnerable, that systems founded on divine right will always be subject to human frailty, that no crown is heavy enough to keep a cracking mind from shattering completely. Look at him one last time, lying there in his death chamber, the jaw that could not chew, the limbs that moved with such terrible caution, the eyes that saw threats in every shadow. He was trying to tell them something, trying to warn them, but no one wanted to listen. He was trying to say, I am fragile, I am breakable, I am glass, and so are you. And so is every structure of power you have built on the assumption that some humans are more solid, more real, more eternal than others. They buried the warning with him. But warnings written in glass never truly disappear. They just wait, patient and transparent, for the next moment when someone picks them up and discovers that the weight they have been carrying was always too heavy for human hands to hold. The Glass King is dead. Long live the Glass King. Because somewhere, right now, someone is wearing a crown and believing themselves invincible, and the first hairline crack is already forming. If this story fascinated you, watch my next video on the secret diseases of royal blood, where we explore how hemophilia destroyed the Russian royal family and changed the course of world history. Because every throne has its weakness, every bloodline carries its curse, and every empire, no matter how powerful, is always just one broken mind away from collapse. Like and subscribe if you want more stories where history's darkest truths are hiding in plain sight, waiting to be discovered. Tell me in the comments, do you think Charles was mad? Or was he the only one sane enough to see that kings were always made of glass? The candles go out, the chamber grows dark, and in that darkness, something fragile breaks. And if you stayed this far, please subscribe to the channel and watch this video next about the most inbred man in European history.